Chapter 3. The Door and the Antechamber. The light did not so much grow brighter as become more certain of itself, the closer they got, until the pale suggestion of it resolved into a door. Corin had seen doors his whole life. Plank doors, iron-bound doors, the low, crooked door of the smithy that old Bram had been meaning to rehang for a decade, and none of them had looked like this. It stood taller than he was, set flush in a stone that had been worked smooth around it like the mountain itself had grown to fit it rather than the other way around. And its surface was carved over every visible inch with lines that curled and interlocked in patterns as I kept trying to read, as writing and failing. The light came from inside the carving itself, the way a coal holds heat after the flame's gone, and it was the only thing in the whole black tunnel that made any sense to look at. "That's not carved by anyone I've ever heard of," he said, which, he was aware, was an enormous understatement. He put his shoulder to it anyway, because a locked door was still just a locked door as far as he was concerned, and it didn't move so much as a hair's width. It felt less like pushing on wood or stone, and more like pushing on a decision that had already been made without him. Aurora stepped past him and put her palm flat against the surface, and the door opened. It didn't creak or grind or do any of the things a door that size ought to do. It simply ceased to be shut, sliding back into the stone with a sound like a long, held breath finally let out, and the light that had been trapped in its carvings spilled forward to reveal a corridor beyond it, smooth-walled, softly lit from no source Corin could find, running further than his eyes could follow into a white that made the tunnel behind them look like exactly what it was, a hole in a mountain, made by hands, waiting for the two of them to notice they didn't belong. "How did you?" He looked at her properly, the sword still loose but forgotten in his hand. "You didn't even try the first way. You just touched it." "I don't know." She was staring at her own palm as if it belonged to someone else. "I didn't think about it. I just knew it would open." Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then, because there was nothing behind them but the dark and the thing that had been pacing them through it, and because whatever waited ahead at least had the decency to be well lit, Corin took her hand again and took one step toward the light. The floor didn't move under him. He was certain of that. Afterwards, turning it over the way he turned over anything that didn't sit right. The floor didn't move, nothing struck him, nothing touched him at all. He simply felt the strength go out of his legs all at once, gently, like a hand closing a book partway through a sentence, and the last thing he was aware of was Aurora's grip on his going slack at the exact same moment his own did, and then nothing. There had, as it happened, been a witness. He had been living in that stretch of tunnel for the better part of 2 years now, ever since the noise and the light of the world above had gotten to be too much for a creature of refined sensibilities such as himself, and he had opinions, many opinions, all of them correct, about two enormous strangers stomping through his den at this hour with a lit sword and no manners whatsoever. He had followed them the whole way, close enough to satisfy his curiosity, far enough to keep all four of his paws firmly under him, should either of them turn out to have terrible aim. He had watched the tall one bruise his shoulder on a door that plainly did not want to be pushed. He had watched the small one open it with nothing but her hand, which he found extremely rude, since he had been trying to get that door open himself with a great deal more finesse and zero success. And then he had watched them both simply fold to the ground like puppets with their strings cut, which he found, on reflection, alarming enough to abandon several long-held opinions about not getting involved in other people's business. He did not get the chance to decide what to do about it. Lights rose out of the floor around the two fallen strangers, small, quick, buzzing things, more insect than machine, and more machine than anything he had a proper word for, and lifted them both, with a gentleness that struck him as almost insulting given how roughly they'd handled his door, and carried them in through the light and out of sight. He sat very still in the dark for a long moment afterwards, ears flat, tail feathers drooping, weighing the situation with the full and considerable weight of his intellect. Then, because even a creature of refined sensibilities has its limits, and because it had been a very long night, he went back to sleep. Corin had no memory of walking through the door or down whatever corridor lay beyond it. That fact registered somewhere in the back of his mind and was set aside because, at that moment, it was very far from the strangest thing happening to him. He and Aurora were standing, upright, steady, neither of them the least bit tired, which was its own small wrongness he didn't have room to examine yet. In a wide, round chamber, empty of anything he recognized as furniture or purpose, its walls curved up into a ceiling too far above them to make out clearly. He'd have called it a temple if it had had an altar. It didn't have an altar. It had, at its center, a column of light that hadn't been there a heartbeat before, rising from floor to ceiling and thickening, slowly, into the shape of a man. Corin's hand found the hilt of his sword, and it did nothing to slow the sheer animal terror rising through him. Every story he'd ever been fed as a boy came back at once, all in a rush. The drowned dead who walked up out of the Aldern on the wrong sort of night, the pale things that were said to wait for travelers who whistled after dark, every warning his own mother had ever given him about places in this valley best left unvisited. None of it had prepared him for this. Ghosts, as every soul in Aldervale understood them, were things glimpsed at the edge of a lantern's reach, thin and flickering and gone if you looked at them straight on. This was neither thin nor flickering. It stood there solid and steady and enormous, glowing like a coal at the heart of a fire. It was looking directly at him with an expression that, on anything mortal, he would have called pleased. He was moving, backwards, fast, one hand dragging Aurora with him by the wrist, both of them retreating across the smooth floor in perfect, wordless agreement until his shoulders hit the curve of the wall and there was simply nowhere left to retreat to. Aurora's back met the stone beside him a heartbeat later, her breathing gone short and disbelieving, her eyes so wide he could see white all the way around them. "That's not possible," she said, in a voice that had shrunk down to almost nothing. "Things like that don't. A ghost isn't supposed to look like that. It isn't supposed to stand like that. I don't think it's a ghost." His own voice came out steadier than he had any right to expect, which struck him distantly as its own small miracle. He had the sword up between himself and the light now. For all the good he expected a blade to do against a thing built out of glow rather than flesh, and some old, unthinking part of him had already put his body half in front of hers without asking his permission first. "I think it might be worse. Worse than a ghost. I don't know what's worse than a ghost. I am making this up exactly as fast as you are." He risked a sideways glance at her, back pressed to the stone, eyes still enormous. "Stay behind me." The figure went very still at the sight of two grown people flattening themselves against a wall like cornered deer, and something crossed its line, grave face that might, on a living man, have been the start of an apology. "Understand this is frightening," it said, in the careful, unhurried tone of a man talking down a spooked horse. "Whatever you were raised to fear about the restless dead, I promise you, that is not what is happening here. You're glowing," Corin said. "You're glowing, and you're standing in the air, and a moment ago you weren't there at all, and you want me to believe you're not one of the dead. I was never among the living to begin with, if that helps." "It does not," said Aurora, faintly, from somewhere very close to his shoulder. "No," the figure agreed. "I imagine it wouldn't." It seemed, for a creature made of light, to consider the problem with real care, and then it did something Corin hadn't expected of a possible haunting. It raised both hands, palms empty, the same gesture any honest man might make to prove he wasn't holding a blade. "Would it help if I stopped doing this part?" Corin did not lower the sword. "Doing what part?" "Hovering, glowing rather more than is strictly necessary. Existing several inches above a floor I don't actually need to stand on, which I'm given to understand reads as considerably more ominous than I intend." And it did stop, settling or appearing to, boots that weren't truly boots meeting stone that didn't truly need meeting, the fierce internal light banking down to something nearer, an ordinary lamp, until it looked, if you squinted hard enough and ignored the faint shimmer still clinging to its edges, almost like a tired man standing too early in a cold room. "Better?" "Marginally," Aurora said, though neither of them moved so much as an inch off the wall. "I have been alone in this room for—" It paused, the same habit catching itself mid-word that it would catch itself with more than once before the morning was through. "A few years, some months, and several days precise enough to bore you, if you'd like it. It only feels longer than that number accounts for." It said this last part in the tone of a man trying out a joke he wasn't entirely sure would land. I confess I have lost all sense of how alarming I am to look at in that time. You are, as it happens, the first honest opinion I've had on the matter in the whole of it. That is not helping your case, Corin said. No, it agreed, almost gently. I don't imagine it is. But I would rather spend a few minutes helping you believe I'm not a danger to you than spend the rest of this morning talking to two people who won't come off that wall. It took a good while longer than a few minutes. Corin counted 3 separate attempts before either of them managed a full step away from the stone at their backs. And even then, it was Aurora who moved first, some hard-won curiosity winning out over the last of her fear, with Corin following only because he wasn't about to let her stand there alone. "Welcome, Sentinel," the figure said at last. Once they'd both found something like solid footing again, and its voice filled the chamber without seeming to come from any obvious direction. "No one has stood where you're standing since the day I was made." Corin kept the sword up, though the shake had mostly left his hand. "Who in every god's name are you?" "My name is Meridian." A pause, as though weighing how much of the truth would help, and how much would only add weight to an already unbearable morning. "I'm not a man, though I was built from the mind of one. I am a guide, left here for exactly this, the day someone finally found their way in." "Found our way in," Corin repeated. "We were running from something that just carried off a child." "I know." Something in the hologram's face shifted, and for just a moment, it looked less like a teacher addressing a student and more like a man forced to watch, from a great distance, something he could do nothing about. That is precisely why this place exists. Aurora hadn't said anything since the door. She was looking at Meridian the way she'd looked at the light in the tunnel. Not afraid, exactly, but wholly, unguardedly caught by it, in a way Corin hadn't seen out of her once since he'd pulled her off the ground outside the village. "Then tell us what it is," Corin said. "All of it. Now. Not all of it. Not yet. Not because I doubt you've earned it, but because some of it will make less sense tonight than it will in a month, and I would rather you trust what I tell you than dismiss it for arriving too fast." Meridian inclined its head, an old habit worn into a new shape. "What I can tell you plainly is this. What came over that ridge this morning did not come from your mountains. It was made deliberately by someone who reached into your world from beyond a door very much like the one you just opened. An enemy, not a god and not a demon. Whatever your village has told itself for comfort. This place was built in secret to give someone a way to fight back. You are the first person to find it since the day it was built." Corin let that sit for exactly as long as it took to decide he didn't have room for it yet. "That's very interesting. I have a village burning behind me, and people who aren't dead yet, but will be if I stand here much longer listening to you." "Then look," Meridian said, and did not ask permission before it did. The light in the chamber's center split and reformed, and where the hologram had stood there was, for a handful of seconds, a window instead. Aldervale, or something enough like it that Corin's stomach dropped before his mind had finished confirming it. Smoke over the tannery roof. The ward watch line thinner than he'd left it. Wren, unhurt, dragging someone toward the healing house by both arms, her mouth moving in words he couldn't hear. It was still happening. Whatever this place was, however long the tunnel had felt, up above it was still the same morning, still the same fight, and he had left it to stand in a cave full of light, asking questions. "You could run back the way you came," Meridian said, gently, as the vision folded back into the shape of a man. "I would not stop you, and I would not think less of you for it. But I don't believe you would reach the line before it broke. And even if you did, one more sword, one more very good bow, has never once been enough to end what's happening up there. What's in the next room might be." Corin looked at Aurora. She looked back at him, and whatever had frozen her outside the village was simply gone, replaced by something that looked, unervingly, like readiness. "What's in the next room?" he said. "Exactly." "Answers," said Meridian. "And attire. You'll want both, and I would rather explain the first while you're putting on the second, because I suspect you will have a great many questions, and we are, both of US, running short on the kind of time where I get to answer them slowly." It turned toward an archway Corin was fairly certain had not been part of the chamber a moment ago, and did not wait to see if they'd follow, which Corin thought was either supreme confidence or a very good read on exactly how much choice they had left. He looked at Aurora once more. She was already walking. Right? He muttered, mostly to himself, and went after her.